quadratic equation is an equation that can be written in the general form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, where a, b, and c are real numbers with a not equal to 0. Key thing here being the highest power of x is an x squared. Okay, a quadratic equation is also called a second-degree polynomial. In this section, we're going to look at several different approaches to solving quadratic equations, as well as some application problems. The first thing, though, we're going to review is complex and imaginary numbers and factoring. Okay, so first, complex numbers. The solution to a square root is a number multiplied by itself to equal the number under the square root. So example, the square root of 9 is 3. And why? Because 3 times 3 equals 9. Okay, what if we considered, though, something like the square root of negative 1? Well, both 1 times 1 equals 1, and negative 1 times negative 1 also equals positive 1. So there is no real number that can be multiplied by itself and equal negative 1. Okay, so to have a solution to the square root of negative 1, a new number system was needed outside of the typical real number system. So we're going to define the square root of negative 1 to be I. Okay, we call I the imaginary number, and not because it doesn't exist, but rather because it's outside of the typical number system. Okay, if we square both sides of our definition, then negative 1 equals I squared, because when you square a square root, it cancels. Okay, so as a result, if you have something like the square root of negative 4, well, the square root of negative 4, square root of 4 is 2, and the square root of a negative is I, so 2I is the answer. If you have the square root of negative 9, well, the square root of negative 9, square root of 9 is 3, and the square root of the negative is I, and so on. Okay, so we're going to come across those in this section as we look at taking square roots to solve quadratics. Another thing we're going to look at in this section is factoring. Okay, so this is technically a review topic for this course, but let's spend some time reviewing it together. When we factor, we're writing a number or an expression as two things multiplied together. Factoring can be useful in solving quadratic equations. It's going to be the first method that we're going to look at. So let's review how to factor quadratic expressions, and then we'll look at how to apply that to solving a quadratic equation here in a little bit. If you already have a method for factoring that you're comfortable with and that you're good at, please continue to use it. But if you have forgotten or you think you're a little rusty, let's review a couple different methods. Okay, so let's look at approach 1, and this is for a equaling 1. Okay, or in other words, the coefficient of x squared is 1. Okay, these are generally considered the easier types of problems to factor because you only need to consider the c term, okay, or the last term. So example number 1, let's factor x squared minus 3x minus 10. Okay, to factor that, again, since there's nothing in front of x squared, it's just a 1, we want to look at negative 10. And what we do off to the side is list the factors of negative 10, looking for the pair that will add up to negative 3 in the middle. So factors of negative 10, negative 1 and 10. If we add those together, we get 9. That's not what we need. Okay, I could switch it around, negative 10 and 1. If I add those together, negative 10 plus 1 is negative 9. That's not what we need in the middle. Negative 2 and 5. Negative 2 plus 5 is 3. That's almost what we want. We want a negative 3, though. And so lastly, negative 5 and 2. Negative 5 plus 2 is negative 3, and that's our term in the middle. So this type of factoring, you can go immediately to your factors of x, first number is minus 5, and our second factor is x plus 2. Okay, so when we factor a quadratic, we're rewriting it as two factors, and those two factors, if you were to multiply them together, you would get back exactly what you had before. Okay, so if we were to FOIL, we would have x times x is x squared, x times 2 is 2x, negative 5 times x is minus 5x, negative 5 times 2 is negative 10. Combine the like terms, x squared minus 3x minus 10. So when we factor, we're not really changing the value, we're just changing how the quadratic looks. Okay. Our second approach is if a is anything other than 1. Okay? If that's the case, then our first approach does not work because we have only taken into account the c term. We have not taken into account the a term. Okay? So there's a variety of methods you could use to factor something with a other than 1. You could use the AC method, the box method, or the guess and check method. And again, if you have a method that you like and you're good at already, then please continue to use that. If not, then we're going to use the AC. So our approach for the AC method is off to the side. We're going to multiply the values for A and C. Okay, and then like our first approach, we're going to list the factors of what we obtain in step 1 until we find the pair of factors that add to the same value as B. Okay, and in step 3 of the AC method, we're going to rewrite our quadratic, replacing B with the factors we identified in step 2. And then our last step is we're going to get our 2 parentheses by factoring by grouping. So example 2, 4x squared minus 13x plus 3. Okay, so we want to take A and C, 4 times 3, that gives us 12. Okay, so this is the only parallel with the other method. We want to list the factors of 12, finding the pair that adds to negative 13. Okay, and you just need to keep listing until you find the correct pair. So if I start with 1 and 12, 1 plus 12 is 13. That's almost what I want. I want negative 13 though. If I go ahead and switch the order, or the signs, negative 1 and negative 12, if I multiply these together, negative 1 and negative 12, that's still positive 12 when I multiply. But now when I add, negative 1 minus 12 is the negative 13 that I'm looking for. Okay, so we want to move now to step 3, rewrite as 4x squared. Instead of negative 13, we're going to use negative 1 and negative 12. So minus 1x minus 12x plus 3. And the order is not important. If you switch these around, negative 12x and minus 1x second, that's fine. You'll get the same answer in the end. Okay. So our last step is to now factor by grouping. To factor by grouping, what we want to do is take the first 2 terms, group them together, second 2 terms, group them together, and factor out what each group has in common. So my first group, 4x squared and minus 1x, 4 and 1 don't really have anything in common, but x squared and x, I can factor an x out of both of those. If I factor x out of 4x squared, I'm left with 4x. And if I factor x out of minus 1x, I'm left with minus 1. Okay, my second group, negative 12x and 3. 12 and 3 are both divisible by 3, so we're going to factor out a 3. Okay, and to make it match what we have here, since we have a negative and then a positive, I'm going to factor out not just a 3, but a negative 3. Okay, and this has an x, this does not, so we aren't going to factor out an x. Okay, but if I factor out negative 3, negative 12 divided by negative 3 is positive 4x, and positive 3 divided by negative 3 is negative 1. Okay, the whole key to factoring by grouping is at this point you should now have 2 identical parentheses. So to finish factoring by grouping, you want to take these 2 identical parentheses, factor them out to the front. And if you factor that out to the front, if you factor 4x minus 1 away from here, you're left with x. And if you factor 4x minus 1 away from here, you're left with minus 3. Okay, so 4x squared minus 13x plus 3 factors into 4x minus 1 times x minus 3. And again, if you were to do FOIL, you would be able to get exactly back to this. So we're not changing any value. We're just changing the way it looks. So now let's look at how do I solve a quadratic equation using factoring. Okay, so one way is to combine factoring with what's called the zero product property. Okay, the zero product property says that if the product of two algebraic expressions is 0, then at least one of the factors is 0. So meaning, if you have two things multiplied together, a and b, and it equals 0, then the only way that that can happen is either a equals 0 or b equals 0. Okay, so since factoring results in two expressions multiplied together, the zero product property allows us to split the factors and set them separately equal to 0. So to solve a quadratic by factoring, okay, we want to, if necessary, rewrite your quadratic equation in the general form with all your terms on the left. Okay, factor completely, apply the zero product property, which will involve you setting each factor containing a variable equal to 0, and then solve your equation in step 3. Okay. Then 5, check the solutions in the original equation. Again, for this type of problem, this is optional again, but it's a good idea, especially on quizzes and tests, so that you know if your solution is correct. So example 3a, let's solve by factoring. 4x squared minus 2x equals 0. So if I solve that by factoring, this one's different than the two we reviewed so far. What's different here is that there's no c term. So this is another type of factoring I'm going to review with you. If there's only two terms, then it's either a difference of two squares, or in this case where they both have an x, we want to factor out the greatest common factor. So both of these have an x, and 4 and 2 are both divisible by 2. So I can factor out a 2x out of each of these. Okay, and if we do that, 4 divided by 2 is 2, and if I factor x out of x squared, I'm left with an x. Okay, minus 2 divided by 2 is 1, and if I factor x out of x, I don't have an x left anymore. Okay, so in this case, since there's no c term, using the greatest common factor will factor this completely. Okay, so step 3 now, apply the zero product property. Zero product property says if these two things are multiplied together and it equals 0, only way that that can happen is 2x has to equal 0, or 2x minus 1 equals 0. So if I solve both of those separately, that will give me two possibilities for x. Okay, this first one, all you have to do is divide by 2, and 0 divided by 2 is 0. So our first solution is 0. And our second equation, add 1 to both sides. 2x equals 1. Divide by 2 on both sides, and x equals 1/2. So our solution set is 0, 1/2. Order's not important. 1/2, 0, same thing. And remember, in your homework, you just will be filling in this box if you have the solution symbol. You don't need to put the set symbol yourself. Example 3b, 2x squared plus 7x equals 4. So on this one, we need to have everything on the same side first. Okay, so we want to first subtract 4 on both sides, canceling it on the right, leaving a 0. On the left-hand side, 2x squared plus 7x minus 4, there's nothing that can be combined there. Since we have something other than 1 in front of x squared, and we do have 3 terms on this one, we're going to use the AC method, or whatever method you're comfortable with. Okay, so AC method, we want to take 2 times -4. That gives us -8. And we want to look for the pair of factors of -8 that will add up to 7 in the middle. Okay, if I start with -1 and 8, okay, -1 plus 8 is 7, so my list is done already. Okay, -1 and 8 are the pair of factors I want. So let's rewrite 2x squared. Instead of 7x, we're going to use minus 1x, and positive 8x, so plus 8x minus 4 equals 0. And again, the order is not important, so if you switch negative 1x and 8x around, that's fine. Your factoring by grouping will look a little different, but you'll still get to the same answer if you do everything correctly. Okay, so group the first two together, group the second two together. 2x squared and minus 1x, 2 and 1, no common factor other than 1. X squared and x, you can factor an x out of both of those. So factor x out of 2x squared, and we have 2x. Factor x out of minus 1x, and we have minus 1. Okay, 8x minus 4. Okay, we have positive and negative, so that's all ready to go. And 8 and 4, both divisible by 4. So we're going to factor out a positive 4, so we should have plus 4. If you factor 4 out of 8, you're left with 2x. And then minus and a positive will leave us with a minus. 4 divided by 4 is 1. Okay, remember factoring by grouping, key to knowing that you're correct is these two should be the exact same. So if we factor that out to the front, if I factor 2x minus 1 away, I'm left with an x. If I factor 2x minus 1 away, I'm left with a 4. Okay, so there's our factoring completely. And now we want to proceed to step 4, solve step 3, apply the zero product property. So if this times this equals 0, only way that happens is either 2x minus 1 equals 0 or x plus 4 equals 0. Okay, last step, solve each of those by adding 1 to both sides. 2x equals 1, divide by 2, and x equals 1/2. This one, all we need to do to solve is subtract 4, and x equals negative 4. So our solution set, 1/2, comma, negative 4.